Today on Brief History, we reflect on a widely unpopular and largely detested English monarch remembered throughout the centuries. Following in the shadow of his much respected father, his reign would be plagued by discontent from the start, and his unkingly behavior would bring questions to the minds of many. His royal choices and personal relationships would lead to rage, revenge, and gruesome consequences. Join me as I take a brief look at Edward of Caernarfon, remembered today as Edward II of England. Edward was born on April 25, 1284, at Caernarfon Castle in Wales, from where his nickname would draw its origin. He was the son of Edward I of England, known as Longshanks, or the Hammer of the Scots, and his mother was Eleanor of Castile. He was the 14th child of approximately 16 children. However, many of his siblings died young, including all of his elder brothers. This left Edward as the heir to the throne of England. Edward's father was concluding his conquest of Wales when it was said that he sent his heavily pregnant wife to the not yet finished Caernarfon Castle to give birth to Edward. He supposedly did this due to the fact that he had promised the Welsh a prince that was born in Wales that spoke no English, and young Edward, as a newborn baby, made this promise come to fruition as he did not yet speak any language. This story has been largely disbelieved, however, and Edward was not officially declared as the Prince of Wales until he was much older. Edward did not have a close relationship to his family, although this was fairly common for royal children. His mother and father departed on a campaign to an English territory on the continent known as Gascony when Edward was 2 years old, and shortly after they returned in 1290, his mother died. The 1290s also saw 3 of his sisters married off, and they left England to join their in-law families on the continent. Edward was educated by Guy Fer, a Gascon knight who had served Edward's mother's family. When he was 6 years old, Edward was betrothed to the heir to the Scottish throne, Margaret of Norway. It was intended that when this young couple grew up, any male children they would have would become the heir to the Scottish and English thrones, thus guaranteeing peace between Scotland and England. However, Margaret died on her way to Scotland, and this marriage was not to take place. This in turn put Scotland into a succession crisis, to which Edward's father used to exert English overlordship over the Scots, eventually conquering Scotland, something that will be discussed shortly. Due to Margaret's death, another bride was needed for Edward, and when he was 14 years old in 1299, he was betrothed to the 4-year-old daughter of Philip IV of France, Isabella, although they were married at a later date. When Edward was 16, he was the first heir to the English throne to be declared Prince of Wales after his father's conquest of the territory. However, this tradition would be continued for future firstborn sons and heirs to the English throne through modern day. As Edward grew, he became a physically imposing character, as was his father. However, the similarities between him and his father ended there. His father was a domineering, brilliant politician and successful military commander, intimately involved in highborn pastimes such as hunting and tournaments. Edward, on the other hand, was a harmless and somewhat simple-minded young man, not interested in highborn pastimes, and developed a reputation for laziness, disinterested in government and the issues at hand. He instead became partial to what was considered in that time low-born occupations, such as that of roof thatching, cart driving, and boat rowing, although it should be noted that he was known to be exceptional at equestrian activities, aka horse riding related activities. Edward was given some small responsibility when his father was on campaign on the continent, but never anything that yielded much power. However, in 1305, when Edward was around 21 years old, he accosted the Bishop of Coventry, Walter Langton, who was also the treasurer of the realm. Walter had been a close and strong ally to Edward's father, and Edward paid the price for his disrespect to such a respected figure. He was banished from his father's court, and his servants were all pulled from his household, and he was forced to follow behind his father at a distance. In addition, he was separated from his friends, something that caused Edward a great deal of dismay. This was mainly due to the fact that his group of friends had come to include a charming, physically athletic, and cocky young man who had worked his way from being Edward's squire to becoming his closest and dearest friend. This young man had developed such a close connection with Edward that many began to take note, including Edward's father, and there were those who speculated that perhaps the relationship between the two young men was more than just a friendship, insinuating homosexuality. The young squire's name was Piers Gaveston, son of a Gascon baron who had served Edward's father for many years. It is not entirely known for sure if Edward's relationship with Gaveston was homosexual, or whether the two men truly considered each other as adopted brothers, or perhaps both. Whatever the case, Edward would go on to have 4 children with his wife, and father at least 2 illegitimate children as well. However, soon young Edward would yield power, and the relationship between him and Gaveston would be catapulted to the forefront of politics and send the realm into chaos. In 1306, Robert the Bruce killed his longtime rival and declared himself as King of Scots, breaking the agreement between Edward's father and the Scots. Edward's father raised an army, and Edward, along with Piers, traveled north together. However, Piers, along with a group of other men, decided to leave England for France in order to partake in tournaments on the continent. This enraged Edward's father, who declared Piers and the other men as deserters and seized their land possessions. Edward's father was eventually convinced to pardon the men, but by that time had acknowledged his son's relationship to Gaveston. He banished Gaveston to the continent, mainly in an attempt to remove him from Edward. However, it was never Piers' intention to leave England for good. In July of 1307, the old King Edward died on his way to engage Robert the Bruce and the Scots, and with that, Edward, 23 years old, was soon to be King of England. Within hours of hearing of his father's death, Edward called for Gaveston's return to England and bestowed the earldom of Cornwall to him, which Edward's father had intended for Edward's stepbrother. Edward then had Gaveston married to his niece and made him his chamberlain, which was a position that entailed being in charge of the king's daily processes. Anyone looking to discuss business or looking to find favor with Edward was directed towards Gaveston. Edward showed such a strong degree of favoritism towards Gaveston and allowed him such free reign that it was said that at that time there were 2 kings in one kingdom. The barons obviously looked upon this with disgust, but this was just the beginning of the problem in relation to Gaveston. Edward traveled to Boulogne to marry Isabella of France in January of 1308, and Gaveston, the Gascon upstart squire, was made keeper of the realm in his absence. When the couple returned, Edward was coronated at Westminster Abbey on February 25, 1308, as Edward II of England, along with Isabella, his queen. However, the coronation was overshadowed by Gaveston's involvement in the ceremony. Gaveston, dressed in royal purple, walked in front of the king and queen, carrying the crown, and at the following feast the hall was decorated with the arms of Edward and Gaveston, instead of that of Edward and Isabella, with Isabella essentially being ignored the entire evening by Edward in favor of Gaveston. The French that were in attendance were outraged and carried messages of the insult back to France. At this point, enraged by the king's favoritism and Gaveston's cocky demeanor with which he carried himself, the barons agreed to a mutual oath to eliminate Gaveston from the realm of England. There were a few important barons that either hesitated at this or refused to oppose Edward. The first was Edward's first cousin, Thomas of Lancaster, son of Edward's father's younger brother, Edmund. The second was Hugh Despenser, known as the Elder, who had been a loyal supporter of Edward's father for many years. Both of these men would play a major role in the future of the disagreement between Edward and the barons. 3 days after the coronation, a parliament was held, where the demand for Gaveston's removal was presented, with Edward refusing, the parliament disbanding, and both sides prepping for war. The barons then created what was known as the Three Articles, also known as the Declaration of 1308. These articles first distinguish a separation between the king and the crown, a concept known today as the Doctrine of Capacities, which stated that subjects owed loyalty to the crown, not just the person who was the king, and were required to correct the king if he fell out of line. Second, the articles demanded the exile of Gaveston, although it did not specifically state his name. Lastly, the articles referenced an additional clause that was added to Edward's coronation oath, which essentially stated that Edward would abide by the laws chosen by the subjects. These articles were presented to Edward when Parliament reconvened in April, with Edward again denying the requests. However, Edward's father-in-law, Philip IV of France, also disgusted by Edward's disrespect towards his daughter, wrote to Edward siding with the barons and causing Edward to finally agree. Gaveston was to give up his earldom of Cornwall and be banished, and the Archbishop of Canterbury stated that he would be excommunicated should he ever return to England. Edward decided to make him Lieutenant of Ireland, with Gaveston sailing to Dublin in June. However, relations between Edward and his cousin Thomas of Lancaster began to sour at this point due to Edward's attempt to bring Gaveston back to England. In fact, Edward was successful in this, as he had communicated with the Pope requesting that Gaveston's excommunication oath be absolved. The Pope issued a papal bull absolving Gaveston, and in June 1309, he returned to England. Edward and the following Parliament made concessions and reforms which were desired by the barons in order that Gaveston reacquired his earldom of Cornwall. Thomas of Lancaster now became the leading opposition to Gaveston, who in a foolish display of arrogance coined nicknames for many of the opposing powerful nobles of the realm. They included Guy de Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, who Gaveston named the Black Dog of Arden; Henry de Lacy, Earl of Lincoln, who Gaveston named Burstbelly; Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke, who Gaveston named Joseph the Jew; and lastly, Thomas of Lancaster himself was named the Churl. With the barons' cause gaining ground, it was decided that action was again needed. At a parliament in February 1310, Edward was presented, under the penalty of deposition, with a plan that involved the implementation of a group of 28 men that would reform the royal government for a year and a half. 21 of these men would be lords of the realm, and were referred to as the Lords Ordainers. Some of these men were hostile towards Edward, and some were friendly towards him. However, Gaveston was not allowed to be a part of this group. Edward and Gaveston traveled north to confront the Scots in an attempt to gain militarily and perhaps gain allies as well. However, nothing of great importance materialized. Edward had lost an immense amount of power to the Lords Ordainers. However, his rival and cousin Thomas of Lancaster had the opposite happen to him. In February 1311, Henry, Earl of Lincoln, Burstbelly to Gaveston, who was Thomas's father-in-law, died, and with that, Thomas inherited the earldoms of Lincoln and Salisbury, which added to the earldoms he already held, including Lancaster, Leicester, and Derby. This made Thomas the most powerful man in England, next to the king, with Thomas controlling a massive swath of connected lands in the north-central part of England. Thomas and the rest of the Lords Ordainers created a series of regulations known as the Ordinances of 1311, which contained 41 clauses. Among them were clauses that forbid Edward from going to war, leaving the realm, appointing ministers, or making grants. In addition, all of his unwanted counselors were to be thrown out, which obviously was to include Gaveston. When presented with these ordinances, Edward rejected them, but offered a compromise. He would accept all clauses if Gaveston would be allowed to stay and keep his earldom. This was rejected by the barons, and eventually Edward was forced to submit. The ordinances became law in September, and Gaveston was to leave by November. However, Piers had no intention of leaving again, and in fact did not leave, as Edward in January 1314 revoked the ordinances and restored Piers to his earldom. More and more barons began to flock to the Lords Ordainers' banners, bent on tracking down Gaveston. Edward decided to travel to York to raise an army, and left Gaveston at Scarborough, and Thomas of Lancaster, along with the Ordainers, used this to their advantage and cut off Edward and Gaveston. The Earl of Pembroke, who Gaveston had coined as Joseph the Jew, laid siege to Gaveston, along with other noblemen, at Scarborough. Eventually, Gaveston submitted to Pembroke, and a parliament was set for July in order to negotiate. Gaveston was to remain in Pembroke's custody until this time. However, Pembroke took Gaveston to Dedington and left him in the custody of only a few guards while he visited his wife. Word of this reached the Earl of Warwick, who Gaveston had labeled the Black Dog of Arden. Warwick gathered a force and traveled through the night to surprise Gaveston on the morning of June 10th. Gaveston was seized by Warwick, taken to Warwick Castle, and thrown into jail. Pembroke, who had actually been a moderate in relation to the other barons, declared that he did not intend for this to happen. However, his lack of security led many to believe that he was involved in the plot. Edward's cousin Thomas of Lancaster and other nobles traveled to Warwick to decide what to do with Gaveston. Shortly thereafter, a decision was reached. Gaveston was led out of Warwick and marched on the road to Kenilworth. Halfway there, at a place known as Blacklow Hill, near the modern town of Leek Wootton, Gaveston was executed, being impaled by two of Thomas of Lancaster's Welsh followers, with his head subsequently being cut off. Although many disdained Gaveston, the way with which the Earl of Lancaster and the Earl of Warwick acted was unacceptable to many, and some reverted back to supporting Edward, including the moderate Earl of Pembroke. Edward, of course, was beside himself with rage and grief and was set his sights on revenge. This revenge, however, would cause many problems and have dire consequences for many within the realm. Edward realized that he needed allies and began to communicate with the Pope, as well as his father-in-law, Philip IV. He was able to bring both to his side, taking out loans with both, and in October 1313, he made agreements with the barons who had been chiefly responsible for Gaveston's death. He publicly pardoned them in return that Gaveston and his followers not be seen as traitors. With the money collected from the papal and French loans, Edward decided to finally address the nagging Scottish issues. Edward had failed to continue his father's campaign he was conducting when he died, and this in turn took pressure off Robert the Bruce and allowed him to gather allies and support. Edward raised a massive army in June 1314 in order to deal with Bruce. It should be noted, however, that many of the ordainers, including Thomas of Lancaster, refused to serve, stating that Edward had not been granted permission by Parliament to wage war, which was now a requirement due to the ordinances that had been passed. In March 1314, Bruce laid siege to Stirling, and Edward moved to relieve the castle. On June 23rd, the Scottish army saw the approaching English forces and fell back, taking up a position on an elevated area of woodland. A group of Edward's knights pursued the fleeing Scots, only to come upon Bruce's larger force, with all the knights being killed or driven off. This, along with disagreements between Edward's leading commanders, caused Edward to camp for the night. During the night, however, a Scottish knight in English service left Edward's camp and traveled to Bruce's, relaying to him the disagreements and overall low morale in the English army. This encouraging report influenced Bruce to stand and fight. The next morning, June 24, 1314, surrounded by the marshy quagmire known as the Bannock Burn, a battle took place. This would become known as the Battle of Bannockburn, and Edward's army, almost twice the size of Bruce's, was defeated, in fact steadily routed, with Edward being forced to flee via open boat back to Berwick. This was an embarrassing loss for Edward, but he did not give up his plan to bring Bruce to heel. However, with the Gaveston disagreement fresh in the minds of many, the loss at Bannockburn made it so Edward could not unite his kingdom against the Scots. In fact, Bruce began to raid the north of England and Ireland, with Edward being able to do little. At this point, the battle between Edward and his cousin Thomas of Lancaster began to heat up. After the defeat at the hands of the Scots, a parliament was called with all in attendance, including those who refused service at Bannockburn. Thomas and the other ordainer lords pushed for strict adherence to the ordinances, which Edward had been ignoring. It is also important to note that many things began to add to Edward's weak position. The weather took a terrible turn around this time, with massive rains destroying crops and causing famine. It was said that around 10% of the population died of starvation during this time, which was compounded by other economic factors. Additionally, Edward's allies, Philip IV and the Pope, both died in 1314, and it was around this time that Edward almost perished in a rowing accident. However, around this time, many of Thomas of Lancaster's allies began to die as well, including the Black Dog of Arden, Earl Guy of Warwick, who had remained as steadfast in the pursuit of the ordinances as Thomas had. Robert the Bruce continued to raid northern English lands and Ireland, but the two hard-headed cousins found it difficult to regain any traction. Eventually, they would reconcile for a short time, with Edward publicly appointing Thomas as the head of his council. In addition, Edward promised to follow the ordinances and stated that Thomas could resign at any time without resentment on Edward's part. But unfortunately, this was not to be, as the majority of people in government supported the king, and Thomas was not able to deal with this opposition, eliminating his presence after 2 months. This would be the last time Thomas would attempt to be involved in government. Due to Thomas's strength in contiguous lands, Edward could do nothing to harass his cousin, as Thomas was too strong. By that time, Edward had begun to show some signs of favoritism yet again, and began building a coalition of loyal barons. His favoritism, although not just one person, as was the case with Piers Gaveston, included Hugh Despenser the Elder, who we briefly touched on previously, but also included Hugh's son, Hugh Despenser the Younger. The elder Despenser had been loyal to Edward for the entirety of Edward's reign. However, the younger Despenser had only recently become part of the king's inner circle. The Despensers and the rest of Edward's inner circle swore an oath to each other, and were all equal in their disdain for Thomas of Lancaster. Edward wished to again confront the Scottish problem in the north, mustered an army, and traveled to York. Thomas of Lancaster again refused to join Edward's ranks and, in fact, placed troops to hold bridges to prevent reinforcements from linking up with Edward and took part in other menacing actions toward him as well. Edward traveled to Thomas's great castle at Pontefract and prepared for battle. However, the ever-moderate Earl of Pembroke, sensing the possibility of civil war, convinced Edward to cease. Thomas's men jeered and mocked Edward's army from the walls as they passed. Edward desperately needed his cousin's help due to the fact that Robert the Bruce had continued to capture English land south of the Scottish border. Edward, however, was between a rock and a hard place. He needed Thomas's help, but could only attain it if he banished his closest inner circle allies, which included the Despensers. Edward's allies obviously pressured him to retain them. In August 1318, the cousins finally met and agreed to a treaty known as the Treaty of Leek, where Thomas would be pardoned for all his prior transgressions, and Edward would confirm the ordinances in return for Thomas forgiving Edward's counselors that he so despised. The future looked bright at that point. This was due in part to the Treaty of Leek, but also for a multitude of other reasons. Robert the Bruce had been excommunicated by the Pope, and an interdict was placed on Scotland. Additionally, the weather began to correct itself, and many of Edward's hated inner circle left his court. However, one of the men of Edward's inner circle remained, and this man, through Edward, would eventually bring terror to the realm and assist in undoing much of the progress that was made. This man was, of course, Hugh Despenser the Younger. In the August of 1319, an army had been raised to yet again advance on Scotland. This time, Thomas's forces were included. The force captured Berwick, but once it had been captured, Edward began to play favorites yet again against the ordinances. Additionally, the Scots pushed into England in a counter-offensive raid on Myton-on-Swale, near York. This caused the already frustrated Thomas to gather his men and leave in order to protect his lands. The campaign could not continue without Thomas and was called off, again another failure in the north notched onto Edward's record. This inevitably led to Edward and Thomas falling out of favor yet again, with Thomas being accused of conspiring with Bruce and the Scots. Hugh Despenser the Younger was the main source of these rumors, although they were not entirely off-based, as it was proven that Thomas was working with Bruce within a couple years. Despenser the Younger became the leading man in Edward's inner circle, and his father, Hugh Despenser the Elder, was also included into this group. Edward made Hugh the Younger his chamberlain, and it was said that at this point the young Hugh gained complete control of Edward. Edward both loved and feared the younger Hugh, and Hugh's financial prowess was utilized to the utmost. Edward valued the younger Despenser's financial understanding due to the fact that he had inherited a difficult financial situation, and many times his financial plight put him at the mercy of his barons. Edward wished the younger Despenser would make him rich, and that is exactly what he set out to do. However, in assisting Edward in attaining his financial goals, Despenser the Younger also looked to further his wealth on a much larger scale as well. He began to conspire to seize valuable lands and castles, and barons who had been, to this point, loyal began to defect, especially ones who held land in Wales. One of these men was a man named Roger Mortimer of Chirk, who was the uncle of the famous Roger Mortimer of Wigmore, who will be discussed shortly. It was said that around this time, Edward underwent a transformation. He began to get up early, take a keen interest in the matters of the realm, and seemed to be much more confident, most likely due to his relationship with the younger Despenser. Enraged by Edward and the younger Despenser's imposition and related to their seized lands, barons began prepping for war, including both Roger Mortimers. They had the support from Thomas of Lancaster, who had been closed up in his lands in central England after a truce was agreed to with the Scots, although it should be noted that he did not intend on physically taking part in any campaign. The hatred for the young Despenser was ever growing, and it was shown again that Edward's favoritism was causing many problems for the realm. Edward had labeled his opposition as contrariants, acting contrary to the crown. These contrariants now made the first war moves by capturing one of Despenser's castles at Newport, followed by others shortly thereafter. There was little opposition, as many of the Despenser's subjects despised the Despensers themselves. Eventually, the contrariant lords recaptured their lost lands, and Edward and Despenser retreated to London. At this point, Thomas of Lancaster re-entered the scene and was focused on removing not only the younger Despenser from Edward's circle, but also Hugh Despenser the Elder, who Thomas believed was just as guilty as Hugh the Younger. Thomas again became the leading figure of the opposition, and some of Edward's closest allies began to defect to Thomas and the contrariant side. Edward attempted to gain support, but was unable to do so when the contrariants marched on London. Edward was urged to submit to their demands or risk being deposed. Edward finally submitted, and the 3 articles discussed before, which conveniently did not mention Piers Gaveston's name, was used towards the Despensers and Edward in the same fashion. Edward was forced to exile and disinherit the Despensers. However, this exile put the contrariants in a precarious position. If they simply went home, Edward would no doubt recall the Despensers and attack them individually, as their power laid in numbers. However, if they remained in a state of war, they could be seen as opposing the king and would be open to the charge of treason. Many barons began to disengage from the situation, putting Edward in a position to avenge his favorites. Avenge his favorites he did, for the Despensers had never really left the realm. They had roamed the English Channel, committing acts of piracy, and in September 1321 they landed, met Edward, and prepared to take the fight to the contrariants. Edward began his onslaught by demanding that the lands taken back from the Despensers be reinstated to them, which the contrariants refused. The contrariants rallied at Gloucester and Worcester, and burnt valuable bridges along the River Severn in an attempt to keep Edward from entering Wales. This forced Edward and his army as far north as Shrewsbury to cross the River Severn, and Edward contacted his Welsh allies to attack from the north. The contrarian army fell apart, with the Roger Mortimers being some of the first to submit and subsequently being imprisoned. Remaining contrarians fled to Thomas of Lancaster's lands, who, although supported the contrarians, chose not to partake in the defense, remaining in his large swath of territory in north-central England. Edward, now fully in control, marched north to confront his cousin once and for all, sending allies to cut off any escape attempt toward Scotland. The Despensers at this point had returned to Edward's side in his march to his cousin's estates. Thomas was in a dire situation, and many of his closest allies began to desert him. Thomas and the remaining contrariants attempted to flee north, but were stopped by Edward's ally force, who had been sent for that very reason. Thomas and the remaining contrariants were captured, with Thomas being transferred back to Pontefract, his crown jewel of castles, which had been taken by Edward around the time that Thomas was captured. He was thrown into his own prison and insulted by Edward and the Despensers to his face. Thomas was tried and convicted of treason the following morning and led to a small hill outside the castle. He was jeered, insulted, and physically attacked by the attendants of the public procession, and Thomas, the cousin of the king and Earl of Lancaster, trembling and nervous, relayed his fears to the clergy in attendance. Moments later, he knelt upon the ground in prayer, where he was executed by the use of a sword, which delivered a few blows to separate his head from his body. This was a major victory for Edward, and he now, for the first time in many years, enjoyed a degree of complete control over his kingdom. Unfortunately, Edward did not have the same conciliatory ideals for those defeated as his father did. Edward was ready for vengeance, for Piers Gaveston, for the Despensers, and for the embarrassment he had suffered at the hands of the nobility. Immediately, many of those who had opposed the king, including important barons of the lands, were captured, hanged, drawn, and quartered. Many were imprisoned or remained in prison, including the Mortimers, while many family members of the contrariants, including wives and children, were imprisoned as well or had their lands seized. Worse yet, some widows were tortured in an attempt to strong-arm them into submission. In 1322, the ordinances were abolished, and a triumvirate of power and cruelty reigned supreme between the 39-year-old Edward and the 2 Despensers. The 3 set out to drain as much wealth from the country as possible in order that they became immensely wealthy, and they were very successful in doing so. Once the Scottish truce ended, raiding began yet again, and Edward raised a massive army and captured Edinburgh. However, he relied on ships to resupply his army, and when they were prevented from reaching Edinburgh due to bad weather and Scottish impedance, again Edward was forced to withdraw from Scotland in failure. Edward would eventually negotiate with the Scots, and a 13-year truce was extended, and both agreed not to pursue claims on the other side of the opposition's border. This, however, relinquished many English castles that were in Scotland, and the barons who controlled them were unsurprisingly unhappy with this agreement. Opposition again began to steadily rise, and a few contrariant rebels who had yet to be captured began to harass the Despensers' lands. Sensing a tide of opposition beginning to swell, Edward decided that he wished to execute Roger Mortimer of Wigmore. Roger's uncle, the other Roger Mortimer of Chirk, had died in prison, and the younger Roger was becoming desperate. In 1323, he was able to drug his guards, rope down the riverside wall, and flee to France. Edward demanded he be returned, but this was ignored, as Edward's relations with France was becoming unstable. Charles IV had come to power in France, the 4th French king in 8 years. Charles demanded that Edward travel to Gascony to pay homage for his Gascon lands on the continent. Edward drug his feet, and this, mixed with a scandal that erupted in Gascony involving French interests, caused war to ensue. Charles quickly moved against Gascony. A truce was reached eventually, but over half of Gascony had been captured by the French by the time it was in place. With this, Queen Isabella entered the picture. A strong intermediary was needed between Edward and Charles, and Isabella was perfectly suited for this role due to the fact that she was Charles' sister. She crossed to France in 1325 and was able to secure an agreement between the two kings. Part of the agreement was to include Edward traveling to France to finally pay homage for his lands. However, Edward decided not to do this and sent his 12-year-old son, Prince Edward, in his place. Prince Edward traveled to France in 1325 and performed homage to his uncle Charles. However, although Edward believed that all was well, trouble was brewing. He did not realize that sending his son and wife would turn out to be a grave mistake on his part. A mistake that would cost him dearly, for now another powerful enemy presented themselves, and this enemy would turn out to be Queen Isabella herself. Queen Isabella had been a faithful and dutiful wife. She bore Edward a child only 4 years prior to her traveling to France to negotiate between her husband and brother. However, in 1324 she began to become discontented with her husband and his favoritism towards the much-hated Despensers. Now in France with her family and son, Isabella declared that she and her son would not return to England until the Despensers were removed. This, of course, was flatly refused by Edward. Isabella was also said to have started an affair with none other than Roger Mortimer of Wigmore, who had recently escaped imprisonment and certain execution as stated previously. Edward used this to his advantage, accusing Isabella of the same thing in which she was accusing him, being influenced by a favorite. Although Isabella and Mortimer's affair was scandalous, with the couple losing much popularity in France, Edward's transgression had by that time built up a coalition of opposition that was too large to overcome. Word of a possible invasion by Isabella and Mortimer reached Edward, along with the news that the French had made an alliance with Scotland, concerning news to say the least, due to the fact that should Isabella and Mortimer invade, a war could erupt on two fronts. Isabella arranged for her son, young Prince Edward, to be married to Philippa of Hainaut, whose father agreed to provide a mercenary army for Isabella. This army, along with Mortimer and the other English barons who were in exile, joined together, and with that Isabella and Mortimer were in a position to invade England. This they did, landing in Suffolk on September 22, 1326. With the terror that Edward and the Despensers had brought upon England, the hated group had little hope of defeating Isabella's army. Countless barons joined Isabella and Mortimer's cause, and many of Edward's royal supporters began to desert him. Edward and the younger Despenser fled to Wales, with Isabella pursuing and reaching Bristol in October. There they captured Hugh the Elder, who had custody of the city. He was tried and convicted of treason, dragged to the gallows, hanged, and beheaded. Edward and the younger Despenser attempted to flee to Ireland, but were stopped by bad weather, and eventually were tracked down and captured at L'Entresant Castle. Despenser knew what awaited him, and attempted to starve himself to death to avoid the inevitable pain that he was about to endure. But Despenser would face the terrible justice for his misdeeds. On November 24, 1326, Despenser was hanged, drawn, castrated, beheaded, and quartered. A fitting punishment, some believe, for such a loathed and evil man. Edward had the seal of England taken from him, thereby ending his rule but not yet his reign. He was taken to Kenilworth Castle, and it was decided not to execute him. However, deposing a divinely anointed king was seen as being against God's will, and so Edward's captors were forced to find a workaround for this. They decided that they would force Edward to abdicate in favor of his young son Prince Edward, now 14 years old. Edward could do little but accept. In January 1327, Edward II of England agreed to abdicate his throne, with his son being crowned shortly thereafter. It was said that Edward, dressed in all black, cried and collapsed on the floor and had to be raised by the men in attendance. After the abdication, he resumed his imprisonment. However, there were multiple attempts to free him. He was eventually moved to Berkeley Castle, and it was said that he was viciously abused by his jailers. However, there is evidence to suggest that his imprisonment may have been reasonable based on the daily allowance awarded to him. Breakout attempts continued to be made, and in September 1327, Roger Mortimer received word that another attempt was abreast. This would be the catalyst to the end of Edward's life. Details of Edward's death remain unclear, but it is believed that on September 21, 1327, he was murdered in his chamber by 3 of Mortimer's servants, Thomas Gurney, William Auckley, and John Maltravers. Details on how he was killed is still debated. Some believe, based on chroniclers of the day, that he was simply suffocated. However, the story that has persisted throughout history was that Edward was killed by having a red-hot poker inserted into his anus, a gruesome fate intended, some believe, to leave no marks on the king's body. Other accounts tell of Edward surviving 1327, escaping and living abroad in a religious house. However, this has never been confirmed. Queen Isabella has long been accused of organizing Edward's harsh treatment and demise, thus giving merit to her nickname, the She-Wolf of France. This very well could be the case, but it should be noted that when Edward was embalmed, his heart was removed, and it was put in a vase and given to Isabella. She kept this until her death, with Edward's heart being placed into a cavity in the breast of her tomb effigy. Perhaps this is an indicator that she did not play a role, or felt regret for doing so. Nevertheless, after Edward was killed, he was embalmed and moved to Gloucester Abbey. Although it was tradition to bury the kings of England at Westminster, due to the fact that he had been deposed, this was seen as improper. He was laid to rest in a Purbeck marble tomb with an elegant spiked canopy and an alabaster effigy, holding a scepter and orb, as would be expected from a king. This tomb effigy, and canopy can still be seen at Gloucester Cathedral to this day. The reign of Edward II is one of the more remembered reigns in the history of the monarchy, due to the drama and cruelty that played out during this time. Edward has been remembered harshly, and for the most part, this criticism seems to be well deserved. But it is important to attempt to critically look at Edward's time as king. Edward followed in the footsteps of perhaps one of the greatest English medieval kings in history, something that historically has been shown to be a difficult position to be in. Although the realm was relatively stable at the time of his ascension, financial burden and war was laid at Edward's feet from the outset, something that is many times overlooked. Edward also, like the despised King John before him, was one of the youngest children in his family, and his nature from an early age seemed to be at odds with what kingship would require from him. But Edward's transgressions cannot be explained away. His favoritism and patronization towards the few was a choice that was costly to others and could certainly have been avoided. Although his favorites may have been blamed for the development of some of the processes that subjugated others, Edward no doubt played an integral role in this, many times benefiting from it greatly. With Edward's choice to support evil counselors that brought chaos to the realm, and with his harsh vengeance and military failures, many today see Edward as one of the worst kings in history, residing somewhere at the bottom of the English monarchy. Some have surely attempted to defend Edward, or perhaps shed some light into why things transpired the way they did, but all have generally agreed that Edward was not a good king in the end. Whatever one may believe, we can agree that Edward paid a hefty price for his actions, and he will remain as a reminder to all of the perilous existence that can befall a perceived treacherous king.